And one of the things the gun control nutbars moan about is the fact that the CDC is no longer allowed to research information that could support gun control. Now, actually, this is a lie as usual. The law only says they cannot advocate for gun control, not that they can't research it. But I'm sure if they did, they'd totally find it, despite the fact that every single other organization ever finds data against it. And guess what? Every single other organization includes the CDC itself. Turns out, in the 1990s, the CDC studied it. They looked into one of the most important questions in the social science surrounding gun policy. How often do innocent citizens use guns in self-defense? They did the studies and promptly buried them.
You know, it's one thing that's so ironic, though, is that when we point this out, the guys are like, but if you're libertarians, then why are you using government sources? It's because the government knows these rules and policies don't work, but they do them anyway, just like with the foreign policy. The CIA has said multiple times in several secret memos, our interventionism is leading to extremism of these countries.
Well, and it's also very effective when you're trying to counter status. Oh, well, I don't believe, Gary Kleck, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Well, okay, here's the CDC. You like the CDC? Here's what they say. And they inquired about defensive gun use, or DGU, in their Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System in 1996, 1997, and 1998, but never again since, and they never reported the results of these surveys. They don't even have anything on their website about the estimates of DGU frequency. They never even acknowledge that they even asked the question, but they do have the data. So in 1996, they surveyed 5,484 people about defensive gun use, in addition to a range of other health-related topics. Later years, the sample size were lower, but still in the thousands. The total sample size from all 3 years is 12,870. There is one problem. They only asked the question of defensive gun use to people who reported owning a gun in the household at the time of the interview, not the time period covered by the survey, so they were undercounting. But even so, the data they collected showed that guns are used defensively by victims over 3 times as often as they're used offensively by criminals. And these results are consistent with Gary Kleck. We mentioned him earlier. He's a criminologist at the University of Florida. He conducted a survey of almost 5,000 individuals about defensive gun use, and the gun control nut bars have been jumping all over themselves to deny it ever since. That survey found that guns are used defensively 2.5 million times a year in the U.S. The CDC's figure is 2.45 million.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in both of those, there is a big range of uncertainty, and if you look at the error bars, it ends up being somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million. But still, there's only like 300,000 violent crimes a year in this country. And meanwhile, the gun control fartwits still cling to the National Crime Victimization Survey, which deliberately lowballed the data. I mean, first of all, people might not exactly be willing to admit this to a government agent who's asking them the question, but even though they severely lowballed it, they still got a figure of 100,000 a year. But here's the thing. They only asked a tiny minority of those surveyed about whether or not they had used a gun defensively, even though they extrapolated it to the entire sample. And you don't get to do that. You only get to look at the ones you ask about it directly and extrapolate from there. And not only that, they only asked this question to people who said they were crime victims, when in a lot of cases, with DGUs, the crime is prevented entirely, meaning the person never becomes a victim to begin with, but the National Crime Victimization Survey assumed that if there was no victim, there wasn't even an attempt.
Actually, here's another good example, about crime victimization and how guns protect people. There was an incident in a Walmart during a Black Friday one time, and, there was a case where a customer pulled a gun on another customer. The internet was all full of people saying, oh, only in America, pull over guns to fight over a new toy and whatnot. But what they didn't mention is because, and I actually looked that story up, yeah, the woman pulled the gun on another customer, but it wasn't because, she wanted something. It was because that customer was grabbing onto her daughter and pulling her hair and assaulting her.
And even that survey is better than the data Michael Shermer recently relied on, which required the criminal to become wounded by the defender.
Yeah.
Because that's what they were doing. They were looking at, let's look at gunshot wounds and how many of them were criminals shot by someone defending and how many of them were, but I mean, you're not counting the vast overwhelming majority. And I mean, all these other studies say that most of the time, all you have to do is show the person that you're armed and they run off.
Yeah, that's why I tell this to all those SJW feminists. Gaston Glock has done far more to protect women than you guys ever did. Because, look, I'm not trying to say women are weak or anything, there's some really strong women out there, but, the average woman, who's only like 150 or whatnot, I forgot the statistic, she doesn't have much of a chance against, a guy who's like 300 pounds of muscle and he bench presses several hundred pounds, just for a warm-up. She doesn't stand much of a chance against him. That's why she needs a gun or something like that.
Well, and it's like, there was this one politician that was saying something like, oh, if you're a woman, you don't want an AR-15, just use a 12 gauge,
Joe Biden, yeah, he said that.
Yeah, and I mean, you look online at women firing 12 gauges and just being literally knocked over by them. Whereas they fire an AR-15 and it's just rat-a-tat-a-tat and, they're just standing there and it's not a problem.
I've seen videos of, big hulking men, struggling to control, the recoil of a 12-gauge shotgun, especially if it's loaded with high-powered hunting slugs, it's...
Yeah, my dad taught me to shoot when I was like, 12 or something like that. And, I mean, I was a skinny kid. I was a beanpole. And that thing... Oh man, I almost lost my footing. It was like, bam, and I was like, I think I'll stick to the 110.
I mean, yeah, that's why the AR-15 is a very popular rifle design, is because it has very low recoil, so you don't, hesitate between shots. It's very good.
Well, and that's another benefit of a suppressor, is it cuts down on all that as well. And
yeah, but
you don't have as much recoil, and you can keep aim between shots. But when you have two independent surveys arriving at the same conclusion as you do with CLEX and the CDC's, it's time to pay attention, and we should have been paying attention for the last 20 years, but unfortunately we couldn't because the CDC never told anyone they had even asked the question. We've criticized the CDC a lot for manipulating their figures on all sorts of things to fit a political narrative. Vaping, COVID, opioids, raw milk, and, of course, guns. In particular, defensive gun use, or DGU. We've got yet another story on how the CDC and the FBI have been working together to deliberately hide defensive gun use data, which is extra important now that there's been another school shooting and the psychotic gun control nutbars are despicably making hay with it. And of course, the news media is complicit in this, running headlines like the AP's "Rare in U.S. for an active shooter to be stopped by bystander" and WAPO's "Rampage in Indiana, a rare instance of armed civilian ending mass shooting." Although, as we've covered many times, armed citizens are very good at stopping mass shootings. Which is why Time magazine, for example, had to argue that the Uvalde shooting debunked the concept, saying that good guys with guns keep failing to stop mass shootings. But that was a case where citizens were not allowed to be armed. The failure was, once again, on the part of police, which is a big reason why we need the right to keep and bear arms, because we can't count on the police to do it. And when the going gets tough, the tough go into denial and suppress the data. For almost a decade, the CDC maintained a reference to a 2013 study from the National Academies of Sciences that showed that people used guns to stop crime anywhere up to 3 million times a year. And then gun control activist Mark Bryant, founder of the Gun Violence Archive, lobbied the CDC to remove misinformation regarding DGU estimates because they keep being cited by gun rights folks to stop gun control legislation. Soon after, the CDC took down these estimates and now gives no data whatsoever on DGUs. The FBI, as we've covered, has also been monkeying around with definitions. We covered in the past how it redefined mass shooting from 4 or more killed other than the shooter to 3. They've also been doing it with the term active shooter, where someone attempts to kill people unknown to him in a populated public area. The issue is, police departments don't record these cases, so they just did Google searches to news stories, which massively underreport these. You can find them, by the way. I'm going to link to a few recent ones, like the 60-year-old Chicago man who was robbed at an ATM and exchanged gunfire with his assailant. The old man survived with a wounded arm. The attacker was killed. Or the break-in in Pennsylvania, where the home invader attacked 2 people, one of whom shot him, wounding him in the leg and stopping the attack. Or the Atlanta story of a woman's ex-boyfriend threatening her with a gun. Her mother shot at him, and he ran off. He's now in jail. Just a reminder that most cases aren't going to make the news because nothing really happens. The gun owner brandishes the gun and scares off the would-be assailant. Nothing to report. So no matter how thorough your Google search is, it's probably not even going to get 1% of the cases. The Crime Prevention Research Center has identified many cases the FBI missed and is trying to make a more thorough list. The FBI identified 350 active shooter cases from 2014 to 2023 and found 14 cases where it was stopped by an armed shooter. But the CPRC found 515 all total from that same time period, 165 more than the FBI, and found that 180 of these cases were stopped by an armed citizen, even after excluding 27 cases where the citizen stopped the attacker before he could fire a shot. Their estimate of armed citizens stopping 35% of active shooters is 8 times higher than the FBI's. And theirs isn't even going to be comprehensive for reasons I just said. And of course, you need to consider where citizens are allowed to go armed. If you forcibly disarm citizens in an area, they're unable to stop the shooters. In places where citizens are allowed to carry firearms, the number jumps from 35% to 51%. It's not so much that the FBI makes these errors or misses these cases, it's that they don't fix them when they're pointed out. And with both the FBI and the CDC, they end up with so many cases they know about but withhold that it has to be intentional. And we all know there's only one reason why they wouldn't want us to have the real numbers.